the signal did not fade. It was still there, still whispering across the stars, though weaker each day as if the voice behind it was slipping into silence. Inside Earth's great capital, deep in a secured chamber lined with glowing screens, the leaders of humanity sat around a long table. Generals, scientists, diplomats, and politicians stared at the same recording again and again. The whisper repeated, soft and broken, but clear enough to carry its desperate meaning. Help! The room felt heavy with silence, as if even the air refused to move until a decision was made. The scientists were the first to speak. They explained that the signal had traveled for centuries, maybe longer. Its origin was far beyond the maps of human exploration, farther than any probe, farther than any colony ship. Whoever sent it had chosen frequencies that could cut through endless void, frequencies so rare and clever that only someone desperate and brilliant would have thought of them. A man with tired eyes, one of the oldest scientists, said quietly, "This was not chance. They wanted someone to hear, even if it took 1,000 years." His words made many shift uncomfortably in their seats. The generals spoke next. One, tall and cold in his uniform, warned that it could be a trap. "We know nothing about the sender. They could be enemies drawing us out. They could be luring us into their war." His voice echoed with the weight of past battles humanity had fought. He tapped the table and leaned forward. "If we commit our fleet, we expose ourselves. Earth will be unguarded." A diplomat shook her head. "And if it is not a trap? If it is truly a cry for help, what will history say of us if we ignore it?" Another leader added, "We claim to be united, to stand for strength and courage. Do we abandon those values when the stars test us?" The arguments grew louder, voices clashing in the chamber like swords. Some wanted caution, some wanted action. A few wanted silence, to bury the signal and pretend it never came. Yet in the corner, an admiral who had been quiet until then finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of oceans. "I have seen men on the battlefield. I have heard them cry out when the night was full of fire and the ground shook with death. Do you know what it feels like to hear someone call for help, and to do nothing?" He let the question hang. No one answered, because everyone in that room had once felt helpless in their own lives. The admiral continued, "We are alive today because our ancestors never gave up on each other. We are strong today because we refused to ignore the weak. If we close our ears now, then we are no longer human." His words struck deep, but not all were convinced. One leader slammed his fist. "Humanity has enemies enough. We do not know what waits for us out there. We might bring back a war we cannot win." The admiral only stared at him, his eyes sharp. "Or we might bring back a victory no one else dared to try." Outside the chamber, the world was already awake with rumors. News feeds carried broken copies of the signal. Journalists whispered about voices from the stars. Citizens filled the streets, listening to recordings on small devices. They did not understand the science, they did not understand the risk, but they understood the word that crossed the stars. Help. In schools, children asked teachers who was calling them. In factories, workers argued about whether humanity should respond. In military bases, soldiers sharpened their weapons and exchanged looks that said more than words, "If the order comes, we are ready." The whisper had reached not just the halls of power but the beating heart of the people. And the people were restless. They remembered Earth's own history, filled with times when no one came to their rescue. Wars where armies fell screaming, disasters where cities cried out into the dark. Humanity had known silence. Humanity had known abandonment. Now, for the first time, someone else had called them. The chamber of leaders knew they could not ignore that. Yet the decision carried danger greater than any they had faced. One scientist presented new data. The whisper had changed. In the faint background, behind the desperate word, there were other sounds. Distant explosions. Static that might have been screams. Echoes of war. The scientist's voice trembled as he said, "This is not only a plea. This is a battlefield." The chamber grew colder. If they answered, they would not be walking into peace. They would be flying straight into a storm of war already burning. For a long time, no one spoke. Each person weighed the risk, the fear, the unknown. The whisper continued on the speakers, broken, fading, almost begging. The admiral looked around the table, his face carved with years of scars and battles. Every second we waste, the voice grows weaker. Every hour we wait, they die a little more. If we stay silent, then humanity has already lost, because we chose fear over courage. His words filled the chamber with heavy silence. Finally, the oldest leader among them, a woman with white hair and a gaze sharp as steel, rose from her seat. She placed her hands on the table and said only 3 words, "We will answer." The decision struck the room like thunder. Some sighed in relief, others clenched their fists in anger, but none could change it now. The order spread through hidden channels, through encrypted lines, through commanders waiting in shadowed bases. The fleet would awaken. Across the world, in drydocks buried under oceans and shipyards hidden behind mountains, engineers received the command they had long prayed for. Sirens began to sound. Lights flickered alive on machines that had slept for decades. Earth's warships, the most fearsome weapons ever forged by human hands, would soon rise again. The whisper had been heard, and Earth would not remain silent. Somewhere, far across the stars, a desperate people still cried for help. They did not know yet, but their whisper had reached warriors. And those warriors were already moving. The order spread across the earth like fire hidden under the surface, silent to the public but burning through secret channels, waking machines and men who had been waiting in shadows for years. In the depths of oceans where sunlight never touched, enormous steel doors groaned open, revealing the sleeping giants of humanity, warships that had not seen the sky in decades. In the silence of frozen mountain bunkers, engines that once shook the heavens began to hum again, their vibrations echoing through the rock like the heartbeat of something alive. One by one, command centers lit up, crew members rushed into stations, and for the first time in a generation, the black hulls of Earth's most fearsome ships began to glow with power. Soldiers stood in line as commanders read the order aloud. Their voices were calm but carried the weight of history. "We sail to answer the call." Every man and woman in the room felt their chest tighten. Some were young, never having seen war, yet their eyes shone with the same fire as veterans who had fought and bled in battles long past. They were not going into the stars for conquest or treasure. They were going because someone had whispered help, and that was enough. Across the planet, people began to notice changes they could not explain. Strange lights rising from the sea at night, shadows of massive ships breaking the clouds at dawn, the thunder of engines rolling over faraway deserts. Governments tried to hide it, but whispers spread. Something was moving, something ancient and powerful, and though the people did not know the truth, they felt it in their bones. Humanity was preparing for something vast. In the great spaceyards orbiting high above Earth, engineers watched as docking clamps released, and ships long sealed began to drift free. Some of these ships were legends, names spoken with respect even among enemies. The Iron Will, scarred from battles against rebel fleets. The Stormbreaker, known for cutting through a blockade in a single night. The Vigilant, old but undefeated, a ship that carried generations of warriors in its steel heart. Now, side by side, they awakened once more. Engines roared to life, their fire lighting the darkness of space. Across control rooms, lights flickered on, screens filled with data, and voices filled the air as crews reported their stations. Weapons online. Engines steady. Shields at full charge. The admiral who had spoken in the council, the one whose words had carried the decision, stood on the command bridge of the fleet's flagship. His face was calm but his eyes burned as he looked at the fleet gathering before him. "We are answering a whisper," he said to his officers. "But let the galaxy remember, when humanity answers, it does not whisper back. It roars." His words echoed across the bridge, and men and women straightened their backs, ready for the unknown. Families on Earth watched the skies and wondered where their sons and daughters were going. Mothers kissed photographs, fathers saluted silently, children pointed at the heavens, asking questions their parents could not answer. The fleet was not leaving quietly. The ground trembled as massive ships broke free from the oceans, climbing into the sky like mountains of steel. Clouds tore apart as their thrusters lit the air with fire. From orbit, the planet seemed alive with motion as hundreds of ships gathered, forming a storm of metal and flame around the blue world. And yet, despite their size and power, the mission carried silence and weight. This was not a march of conquest. It was a march of duty. Somewhere across the stars, a voice had whispered, and humanity had chosen to respond. Inside the ships, young cadets touched the cold walls of their vessels, whispering promises that they would return. Veterans checked their weapons, cleaning them with steady hands, remembering the faces of those they had lost before. Fear walked among them, but so did courage, and courage walked louder. In secret hangars, drones were loaded, carriers filled with supplies, weapons locked into place. Every detail mattered, because no one knew what awaited them. Would they find survivors? Would they find ruins? Would they find an enemy more terrible than any humanity had faced before? No answer came. Only the whisper, weaker each day, as if begging them to hurry. The admiral gave the final command. Open the gates. Massive stations orbiting Earth groaned as great doors parted, revealing the long black paths that stretched into deep space. The fleet aligned, hundreds of warships turning as one, their engines glowing like stars. On Earth, millions watched the skies flare with light as the fleet began its march into the unknown. Some wept, some cheered, some prayed, but all felt the same weight, the weight of a choice that would change everything. As the first ships jumped into faster-than-light travel, a low hum spread through the void. One by one, streaks of fire cut across the dark as the fleet vanished into the stars. The planet below was silent again, but in the silence there was pride, and in the pride there was fear. Humanity had awakened its warships, its deadliest warriors, and sent them into the deep. Somewhere across galaxies, someone would soon learn that their whisper had been heard. And somewhere in the darkness, enemies who had never feared before would soon discover what it meant when Earth's fleet arrived. The admiral stood on his bridge, staring into the black ocean of space. "We are coming," he whispered, not to his crew, not to the council, but to the faint voice still echoing through the speakers. And though the stars did not answer, deep inside, he knew someone out there was waiting for him to arrive. The fleet roared onward, and with it, humanity's promise traveled across the universe. The whisper had awoken warriors. In the endless silence of space, something moved that was not supposed to be heard. It was not a shout, not a message sent with power, but a soft, broken sound that floated across the stars like a dying breath. A whisper. At first no one noticed it. The stars burned, the planet spun, and space kept its secrets. But deep beneath Earth's surface, inside a dark hall filled with machines that never slept, the whisper found a listener. A small signal light blinked on a screen. A technician leaned forward, confused. He thought it was an error, some static from the black void. But when he pressed his headset close, he heard it. Just one word, stretched and weak, repeated again and again. Help. The technician froze. His heart beat faster. He checked the frequency, the source, the strength. It was impossible. The signal came from farther than any human probe had ever gone. It was old, broken, and yet still alive. He called his supervisor, who called another, and soon the quiet hall was full of people staring at the same screen, listening to the same word. Help. For hours they tested it, doubted it, tried to prove it was fake. But the more they listened, the more they realized it was no error. It was real. Someone, or something, was whispering through the stars. When the news reached the scientists of Earth, the world held its breath. The message was carried to secret rooms where generals and leaders sat around long tables. Some looked excited, some looked afraid. The scientists explained that the signal was ancient but steady. They showed recordings. The whisper was almost too soft to hear, but it carried meaning. A cry for help. A cry that had traveled for lifetimes to reach them. No one knew who had sent it. No one knew if they were still alive. But the whisper repeated again and again, like a heart refusing to stop. The leaders argued. Some said it was too dangerous. We don't know who they are. It could be a trap. Others said it was not humanity's problem. We have enough problems of our own. Why risk our people for strangers? But a few voices were different. A gray-haired general spoke, his voice steady as stone. Once, long ago, our ancestors sent distress calls into the dark. They hoped someone would hear them if disaster ever came. Imagine if no one had answered. Imagine the silence. His words hung in the room like a heavy weight. For a moment, no one spoke. Across Earth, people began to whisper too. The story leaked, as stories always do. News reports, rumors, secret recordings of the signal, all spreading through the streets. In every city, people gathered around screens, listening. They heard the faint, broken cry from across the stars. Help! It stirred something deep inside them. Fear, yes, but also something older. Humanity knew what it meant to suffer, to call for aid, to hope against hope that someone stronger would hear. The whisper was not just a sound. It was a mirror. Children asked their parents, "Who is calling us?" Soldiers in their barracks tightened their fists. Old veterans remembered their own cries from battlefields long past. The whisper united them all in one question: should we answer? And if we do, what waits for us out there? In the cold night, one man stood alone on a rooftop, looking up at the stars. He was an admiral, retired, his uniform folded away years ago. But as he listened to the whisper on a small device in his hand, he felt the fire return to his blood. He whispered back, though no one could hear him, "Hold on. We are coming." But not everyone felt the same. In another part of the world, a powerful leader shook his head. "We will not risk our ships for ghosts. The stars are not ours to save." Yet even as he spoke, others disagreed. The debate grew fierce. And while humans argued, the whisper grew weaker, fading as though the voice behind it was losing strength. Scientists warned, if we delay, the signal may die. Whoever is calling will be gone. The weight of those words pressed heavy on the Council of Earth. If they did nothing, they would never know who had called. They would never know what fate had fallen on the whisperer. And they would never know what kind of enemy had made them cry out across galaxies. In the end, it was not logic that made the choice. It was something else, something deeply human. A memory of dark times when humanity itself had begged for help and received none. A memory of wars, disasters, and silent prayers that no one answered. This time, humanity would not be the one to stay silent. This time, the stars would know Earth had listened. The decision was made in secret, behind closed doors. The order was signed. Earth's most fearsome warships, sleeping in hidden docks and forgotten stations, would awaken once more. The whisper would not be left unanswered. Humanity would sail the stars again, not for conquest, not for wealth, but for something greater. For the voice that called to them, faint and dying, from across the endless dark. As the meeting ended, the scientists returned to their screens. The whisper still repeated, weaker now. They did not know how much longer it would last. But, in their hearts, they hoped. For the first time, the whisper was no longer alone. Somewhere far away, in a place broken and burning, someone waited in silence. They did not know if their cry had reached anyone. They did not know if anyone still cared. But in the shadows of their despair, a flicker of hope stirred. Because across the void, Earth had heard. The stars no longer felt so silent. The fleet tore through the dark like a storm of fire, their engines burning trails of light that vanished into the endless black, faster than light drives carrying them across distances no human eye could measure, and though the ships were many, they moved as one, guided by the faint signal that still whispered in their ears, the same word repeated again and again, growing weaker with every day, help. Inside the flagship, the admiral stood on the wide bridge, surrounded by officers and screens filled with shifting stars, and he listened as his crew reported the same message over and over, signal still active, strength fading, and each time he felt the same heavy pull in his chest, a reminder that time was not their ally, that whoever had called them might already be dying. The journey was not smooth, because the void between stars is never empty, and soon the fleet passed through fields of broken rock where ancient moons had shattered long ago, their jagged remains drifting like teeth waiting to bite, and though the ships were strong, the pilots tightened their grips, weaving the giants of steel through the dangerous paths as if dancing with death. From the windows, young cadets stared wide-eyed at sights they had never imagined. Gas clouds glowing blue and green like ghostly oceans, suns burning red like bleeding hearts, the bones of forgotten ships floating silently, their metal rusted and cracked, markers of wars that had ended before humans had ever touched the stars. The whisper guided them, always ahead, faint but steady, pulling them closer to something unseen. Yet with each jump, each new system they entered, they found more signs of destruction. First it was only a few ruined satellites drifting cold, then it was shattered colonies with no lights left burning, and then entire stations, blackened and broken, their hulls torn open, their people long gone. Soldiers in the fleet grew silent as they watched, the young ones clutching their weapons tighter, the veterans narrowing their eyes because they had seen this kind of ruin before, the kind left not by accident but by war. In the mess halls, whispers passed from table to table, not the signal this time, but human voices full of doubt. Who are they? What enemy does this? And if they are strong enough to burn worlds, what chance do we have? But others answered with steel in their voices, we are humanity's fleet, and we were not built to run. In quiet corners, some prayed, not for victory, but for the unknown souls who had sent the whisper, hoping they still lived, hoping it was not too late. Days turned into weeks, though time blurred in the dark, and the journey carried the fleet deeper into uncharted space. The further they went, the stranger the silence became. No friendly signals, no trade routes, no sign of life, only the fading cry calling them onward. The admiral stood often at the front of his bridge, staring into the void, his hands behind his back, his mind heavy with questions he never spoke aloud. Were they chasing ghosts? Would they arrive only to find ashes? And yet even as these thoughts pressed on him, he knew he could not stop. Humanity had made its choice, and to turn back now would be to betray not only the whisper but themselves. Then one night cycle, as the fleet drifted through the edge of a dying system, they saw it. At first it was only shadows in the distance, then as their scanners cleared, they realized they were looking at the remains of a battle. Dozens of ships floated dead, torn apart, their hulls burned and melted, their weapons silent forever. Some were massive, far larger than any human ship, now nothing but carcasses drifting in the dark. Others were small, fragile, shattered into dust. The battlefield stretched for thousands of kilometers, a silent graveyard untouched for years, maybe decades. And yet, in the middle of the wrecks, the whisper grew louder. The scientists on the flagship gasped. It's close. The source is here. The admiral ordered the fleet to slow, their engines dimming as the warships drifted carefully through the graveyard. The soldiers pressed against their windows, looking out at the broken giants around them, feeling the weight of the silence pressing on their hearts. Somewhere among the dead ships, someone was still alive, still whispering, still begging for help. As they searched, they found more signs of horror. Some ships bore marks of weapons unlike anything humans had ever seen, cuts so clean they looked as if entire hulls had been sliced open by invisible blades. Others were burned black by fire so hot it had melted steel into rivers. And in the distance, among the wreckage, floated something different. A small vessel, barely larger than a human frigate, its hull cracked, its lights almost dead, but a faint pulse blinking on its side like a heartbeat refusing to stop. The whisper was coming from there. Cheers broke out across the fleet, but the admiral raised a hand, silencing them. His eyes narrowed. If they survived, then where is the enemy that did this? His words turned the cheers into silence again. For even as hope sparked, fear lingered. No one could destroy such fleets and vanish without leaving a shadow. Yet no sign of the attackers remained. Only the dead ships, the broken ruins, and the faint whisper leading them onward. The admiral gave his order. Prepare to make contact. But keep the guns ready. The grave is never empty. And as the fleet adjusted its course toward the dying ship, soldiers across the decks felt their hearts pounding. The journey through the stars had brought them to this moment. They had followed the whisper across galaxies, through silence and ruin, and now at last they were about to discover who had called them, and what kind of enemy could make even the bravest voices cry out for help. The fleet drifted closer to the broken vessel, their massive shadows passing over the ruins of the dead battlefield, and though the ships of Earth were alive with power and fire, silence ruled the stars around them, a silence so heavy that even the soldiers felt it pressing on their skin as if the void itself was watching. The small vessel, cracked and dark, looked more like a tomb than a living ship, its metal scorched, its engines dead, its hull marked with wounds from battles no human could yet understand. But among the wreckage a faint pulse of light blinked again and again, a heartbeat of hope, and from it the whisper still came, weak but alive, a voice that refused to surrender. Help! On the flagship's bridge the admiral stood tall, his eyes fixed on the screen where the vessel floated like a ghost. His voice was steady when he gave the order. Bring us closer. Prepare a boarding team. At once the fleet moved, smaller escort ships gliding forward with careful precision, weapons armed but shields raised to protect the broken survivor. The closer they came, the more details appeared. Burned symbols carved into the hull, foreign markings unlike any language humanity had seen, desperate patches where the crew had tried to seal holes with melted metal, the scars of hopeless struggle. When the boarding team suited up, tension filled the air. Young soldiers checked their rifles again and again, veterans gave last-minute instructions, and the commander of the team, a woman with eyes sharp as blades, spoke quietly to her unit. Whatever we find in there, remember why we came. They called, and we answered. The boarding ship detached and floated toward the broken vessel, docking with a slow hiss of pressure. For a moment nothing happened. Then the doors opened, and the humans stepped into the dark. Inside the vessel, silence ruled. The air was thin, the lights nearly dead, flickering like dying stars. The walls were covered in strange symbols, handprints smeared in ash, and broken tools scattered across the floor. The soldiers moved cautiously, beams of light cutting through the gloom. And then they saw them. Survivors. At first it was hard to tell if they were alive. Shapes huddled against the walls, thin and weak, their skin pale with exhaustion, their eyes wide with fear. When the humans approached, one of them stirred, lifting a trembling arm, its fingers long and delicate, its voice no more than a whisper that matched the signal they had chased across the galaxy. Help! The soldiers froze, their hearts pounding. This was no trap, no trick. These were people, alien yet familiar in their suffering, who had fought and bled and begged across the stars until Earth had heard. One soldier dropped to his knees, offering water from his pack, and the alien drank with shaking hands. Others moved to help, wrapping wounds, checking vitals, whispering words of comfort the survivors could not understand but felt all the same. Back on the flagship the admiral listened as reports came in. Survivors found. Severe injuries. Malnourished. But alive. For a brief moment, the bridge filled with a cheer, but the admiral did not smile. His eyes stayed fixed on the dead battlefield outside, on the shadows between the wrecks, and his voice was grim. If they are alive, then the enemy that did this may still be near. Meanwhile, inside the broken vessel, the survivors tried to speak. Their voices were weak, their language strange, but with every word the humans tried to understand, recording, translating, piecing together fragments. Slowly the message became clear. These people had been attacked by an empire, a force merciless and vast, who destroyed worlds without pity. Their fleets had stood against them but had been broken, one by one, until only a handful of ships remained. The survivors had fled, sending their desperate signal into the void as their last hope. And now, after so long, someone had come. Tears, not human but the same in their meaning, filled alien eyes as they realized they were not alone. For the first time in years, they were not abandoned. Yet even as this fragile hope sparked, alarms suddenly flared across the human fleet. Scanners lit up with signals. Movement at the edge of the system. Ships. Many ships. The enemy had returned. The admiral's face hardened. All units, battle stations. Protect the survivors. Across the fleet, soldiers rushed to their stations, weapons powered up, engines roared louder, shields shimmered with energy. The survivors in the broken vessel trembled, their weak voices warning, "They come! They come!" And their fear carried weight because they had seen what these enemies could do. Out of the darkness they appeared, vast shapes sliding into view, black ships covered in cruel spikes, their weapons glowing with a sick red light. They moved with confidence, like hunters who believed the prey was already trapped. And when they saw the human fleet gathered around the broken vessel, their calms burst with mocking laughter. "You came for a whisper," a voice thundered across the void, cold and merciless. "Now you will die with them." The human officers exchanged tense looks, but the admiral did not flinch. His voice was iron. "Tell the fleet, hold formation. We do not run. Not now, not ever." In the broken vessel, the survivors heard his words through the translators. They looked at each other in shock, for they had expected fear, retreat, silence. But what they saw instead were warriors who stood ready to face the storm. For the first time, their whisper had not only been heard, it had been answered. And the answer carried fire. The enemy ships closed in, weapons glowing brighter, preparing to unleash destruction. The humans adjusted their targeting systems, fingers tight on triggers, hearts pounding. The void between them filled with silence, the kind of silence that comes before thunder. First contact had been made, not only with the survivors who had whispered across the stars, but with the enemy who had tried to silence them. And now, in this graveyard of broken fleets, the deadliest warships of Earth prepared to show the galaxy what it meant when humanity finally roared. The enemy ships spread across the void like a dark tide, their hulls jagged and cruel, engines burning with red fire as if the stars themselves were bleeding, and for a moment the human fleet stood silent, watching the shadows draw closer, every soldier and officer feeling the weight of what was about to come. Yet none stepped back, none faltered, for they had crossed the stars not to run but to stand. On the flagship's bridge the admiral's voice cut through the tension like steel, "Hold the line. Shield the survivors. We fight here." The order raced through every ship, and across the fleet crews scrambled into action, engineers locking down power grids, gunners aligning massive cannons, pilots strapping in with eyes sharp as blades, all hearts beating together with one purpose. Inside the broken alien vessel the survivors trembled, their thin hands clutching at each other as the shadows outside grew larger, their memories filled with the screams of their worlds burning. But when they saw the human warships form a wall around them their fear shifted into something fragile, something new, a hope they had thought forever lost. The enemy commander's voice echoed again through the comms, cruel and mocking. "Protect them if you wish, little humans, but you will die as they died. Your bones will join theirs in the grave of stars." But the admiral only replied with silence, his eyes fixed on the tactical display where enemy ships now moved into striking positions, their numbers vast, far greater than expected, yet he knew retreat was death, surrender was impossible, so the only answer was to fight. Then, without warning, the void exploded in fire as the enemy opened the first strike, beams of red light lancing across space, slamming against human shields with thunderous impact, shaking entire ships as if giants had struck them with hammers. Alarms screamed, metal groaned, but the line held. In return, Earth's warships answered with fury, unleashing torrents of plasma fire, railguns roaring, missiles cutting paths of light through the darkness, each shot carrying the wrath of humanity across the stars. The battlefield became a storm, explosions tearing holes in the void, debris scattering like shattered bones, fire dancing across hulls as both sides struck with unrelenting force. On one destroyer, young gunners shouted as they fired again and again, their hands shaking but their aim true, watching an enemy cruiser erupt in flames and break apart, a small victory in the sea of chaos. Yet for every enemy ship destroyed 2 more pressed forward, and the weight of their numbers became clear, the humans were outmatched. Still the fleet fought, their formation tight, their purpose unbroken, every captain knowing they must hold the line or all would be lost. In the broken vessel, the survivors listened to the thunder outside, and though they could not see the battle their hearts knew it, every tremor through the hull telling them that humanity had chosen to stand in their place, to take the storm they themselves could not withstand, and tears filled their weary eyes because for the first time in years someone had said with action, "You are not alone." But shadows were not only in the enemy ships outside. Strange signals flickered across the human scanners, ghost readings of vessels that seemed to appear and vanish like phantoms, whispers of cloaked ships moving in the dark, unseen but deadly. On the flagship's bridge the sensor officer shouted, "Contacts, disappearing and reappearing. They are surrounding us." The admiral's jaw tightened. He had expected this. The enemy used fear as a weapon, shadows as their shield. "Tell the fleet," he said calmly, "do not chase the ghosts. Lock formation. Fire only when you see the strike." Moments later the shadows revealed themselves, ships uncloaking at knife range, unleashing torrents of red fire that tore into human ships with brutal force. One cruiser vanished in a sudden blaze, its crew's final screams cut short, and for a heartbeat despair threatened the fleet. But then the humans answered with precision, turning their guns as one, tearing the hidden ships apart with concentrated fire, refusing to scatter, refusing to be broken. The battle raged on, the void becoming a sea of wreckage and flame, yet through the chaos something else began to emerge. The humans were adapting, learning the enemy's patterns, predicting where the shadows would strike next, turning their weakness into strength. The enemy had expected fear, panic, retreat, but instead they found warriors who fought with iron discipline and unyielding resolve, and for the first time their mocking voices grew quiet. On the broken vessel the alien survivors felt the shift too, the storm outside no longer only terror but also defiance, and one among them whispered in awe, "They fight the shadows, and the shadows fear them." Still, the cost was high. Human ships burned, lives were lost, and the fleet bled to hold the line. Yet even in loss there was no surrender. Every fallen ship gave the others more time, every sacrifice a shield for the survivors who had whispered across the stars, and in that sacrifice humanity found its fire. At last, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, the enemy pulled back, their shadows slipping into the void once more, leaving behind wreckage, silence, and the echo of their fury. The battlefield grew still, fires drifting among the stars, the dead honored in silence. On the flagship the admiral stood unmoving, his eyes on the broken vessel they had protected, his voice heavy but strong. "Report." One by one the captains answered, losses counted, victories marked, and though the fleet had suffered they still stood, and more important, the survivors lived. For the first time in generations, those who had whispered for help had found it answered not by silence, not by death, but by warriors who had stood against the shadows and refused to fall. Yet deep inside the admiral's thoughts a cold truth settled. This was only the beginning. The shadows had tested them, had measured them, and they would return, stronger, more merciless. The survivors' stories of burned worlds and endless war were no longer distant tales, they were warnings of what awaited. And so, as the wounded were cared for and the dead honored, the admiral gave the next command. "Begin preparations. We will not wait for the shadows to come again. Next time, we hunt them." And across the fleet, weary but unbroken, the warriors of Earth understood. The whisper that had reached them had not only summoned warships, it had awakened humanity's fire, and that fire would not be put out. The human fleet drifted among the wreckage, their ships scarred and battered but still burning with power, and though the silence after battle hung heavy, no one mistook it for peace, for everyone aboard knew the enemy had not been defeated, only driven back into the dark, waiting, watching, planning their return, and so the admiral's voice rang out across the fleet like a bell of iron, "We do not wait for shadows to strike again. From this moment, we hunt." The order spread like fire, filling the hearts of soldiers and captains with grim resolve, and in the broken alien vessel the survivors listened, their eyes wide with disbelief, for they had spent years running, hiding, whispering into the void. But these humans spoke of chasing the very terror that had broken empires, and though it seemed impossible, their voices carried the weight of truth. For these were warriors who had stood against the storm and still stood. Preparations began at once, engineers swarming through damaged corridors to repair shields and weapons, medics tending to the wounded, captains studying the battlefield maps, marking the paths where the enemy ships had slipped away, trying to trace the trail back to its heart. On the flagship the admiral gathered his officers, a circle of hardened faces lit by the glow of tactical screens, and spoke with steady calm. "We now know their patterns. They fight from the dark, but even shadows leave traces. We will follow their scars across the stars. We will find where they come from." One officer hesitated, his voice low. "Sir, if the survivors are correct, their empire is vast, stronger than anything we have faced." The admiral met his gaze without blinking. "Then we must strike before they are ready, for if we wait they will come with more fire, more death, and by then it will be too late. The decision was final. The hunt had begun. The survivors, weak but determined, offered what knowledge they had, drawing crude maps of systems once ruled by their people, worlds now silent or burning, routes where the enemy had struck hardest, and though their voices shook with fear, they spoke, for they saw in the humans not only warriors but the last chance to end the endless night. Slowly a path took shape, a trail of ruined worlds leading toward the dark heart of the enemy, and the admiral gave the command, "Set course." Engines roared as the fleet moved, leaving behind the graveyard of the first battle, carrying with them the survivors whose whisper had summoned them, carrying the fire of humanity into the unknown. Days passed as the fleet crossed system after system, and with each new world the truth of the enemy's cruelty became clearer. Planets burned to ash, stations reduced to rubble, signals silent where once voices had lived, and the survivors wept at each sight, their pain heavy, but the humans only grew colder, their resolve turning into steel, for every ruin they saw was a promise of vengeance. The shadows did not make the journey easy. Again and again cloaked ships struck from the dark, ambushing with sudden fire, testing the human strength. But each time the fleet responded faster, sharper, no longer surprised by the enemy's tricks. Where once the shadows had been hunters, now they became the hunted, their ambushes turning into traps for themselves, their laughter fading into silence as human guns tore them apart. In the barracks soldiers spoke in low voices, their fear slowly replaced with grim pride, telling each other, "They thought we would break. But look, we chased them." Among the survivors hope grew brighter, and one night an elder among them, frail and scarred, whispered to a young human officer, "Long ago we dreamed someone would come, someone who would not run, and now I see that dream in you." The officer had no words, only a quiet nod, but in his heart the fire burned hotter. Finally the fleet reached a system marked on the survivors' maps, a place once called a stronghold, now nothing but ruins, but in the ruins signals stirred, faint at first, then stronger, until the screens lit with patterns of enemy movement. The admiral studied them with cold eyes. "We are close. Too close for them to ignore." As if in answer, the shadows struck again, not with small raiding ships but with a formation larger than before, their black hulls pouring from the dark like a river of knives, their red lights glowing like bleeding eyes. But this time the humans did not wait to be struck. The admiral's voice thundered across the comms. "All units, fire on my mark. Show them the hunters they have made." At his signal the fleet unleashed a storm, plasma and missiles tearing across the void, the first shots not of defense but of attack, and for the first time the enemy was forced onto its back foot, their ships scrambling to form ranks, their shadows pierced by human fire. The battle raged hot, louder and brighter than the last, and though the enemy still outnumbered the humans, the balance had shifted, the surprise now theirs, the hunters shaken by prey that refused to be prey. In the broken vessel the survivors clung to the walls as explosions shook the hull, but their fear was mixed with awe, for they saw in the fire outside the truth of humanity's vow. The whisper had not only been heard, it had been transformed into a roar that echoed across the stars. The hunt had begun, and the shadows for the first time in ages felt the taste of fear. As the battle blazed on, the admiral looked at the endless dark where more ships surely waited, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is only the beginning. We will not stop until their empire is ashes." And across the fleet, every heart answered the same, the vow carried in silence but stronger than any shout, for humanity had stepped from the light into the dark not as prey but as hunters, and the galaxy would soon learn that the whisper across the stars had awakened something far deadlier than shadows. It had awakened the wrath of Earth. The human fleet pushed deeper into enemy territory, following trails of wreckage and ruined systems, each step forward like walking into the jaws of a beast, yet the admiral never wavered, his orders clear, his eyes set on the path ahead, for he knew the whispers of survivors had revealed more than just pain, they had revealed a direction, a thread leading to the very heart of the empire that had cast shadows across the stars. The survivors, weak but growing stronger under human care, pointed to each new system, telling their stories in broken voices, their maps scratched with shaking hands, and every tale spoke of the same truth. An empire of cruelty ruled from a dark world where fleets were born and death was commanded. The humans listened, their anger deepening with every word, until the promise of vengeance became a vow carved into their very souls. Days turned into weeks as the fleet pressed on, meeting resistance at every step. Enemy ships struck from the dark, ambush after ambush, But humanity had learned, humanity had adapted, and each time the hunters became the hunted, shadows torn apart by the fire of Earth's guns, until the enemy began to pull back, retreating deeper, luring them closer to the core. Some officers whispered that it was a trap, that they were being drawn into a noose, but the admiral only answered, "Then we will break the noose and hang them with it." His voice gave strength, and the fleet pressed on. At last, the survivors spoke of a place unlike any other, a system cloaked in storms, hidden by veils of radiation, guarded by fleets so vast they blotted out the stars, the place where the enemy's high command ruled, the beating heart of darkness itself. As the humans drew near, signs grew clear. Scattered patrols vanishing before contact, strange energy readings twisting scanners, the void itself whispering with menace as if warning them to turn back. But the humans did not turn. On the flagship's bridge silence ruled as the system came into view, and then the storm appeared. A vast field of radiation storms wrapped the heart like a serpent, bolts of energy tearing through the void, clouds of violent light swirling, making entry nearly impossible. But beyond the storm sensors caught glimpses of massive structures, stations larger than cities, shipyards birthing fleets, and warships so vast they dwarfed anything humanity had built. The officers stared, awe and dread mixing in their eyes, but the admiral's gaze was steady. There it is. The heart of darkness. At once the enemy appeared, fleets pouring from the storm like shadows made flesh, countless ships rising to block the path, their red lights glowing brighter than ever, their voices filling the comms with cruel laughter. "You have come far, little humans, but here you end, here the whisper dies." Yet no fear answered, only the admiral's calm order. "All units, hold formation. Remember why we came. For every world burned, for every voice silenced, today we strike at the heart." Across the fleet men and women tightened their grips, their ships roaring with energy, and the survivors in their broken vessel whispered prayers not of fear but of hope. For never in their dreams had they believed anyone would dare to face this place, and yet here stood humanity. The first clash was like the opening of hell. The enemy charged in endless waves, their fire pouring across the void like rain of blood, but the humans answered with precision, their cannons tearing through lines, their missiles cracking open the larger cruisers, their discipline holding them firm against the storm. Explosions lit the void, debris rained across the field, and the storm itself burned with light from dying ships. But numbers were against them, and soon human shields began to falter, hulls groaning under endless assault, and one by one ships fell, torn apart by fire, their crews vanishing into silence. Yet still the line held, still the vow burned, for each fallen ship bought time for the others, and each sacrifice became fuel for vengeance. Deep in the battle, a squadron of enemy ships broke through, racing toward the broken vessel where the survivors were kept, hoping to destroy the very reason the humans had come. But an Earth destroyer hurled itself in their path, shields burning, hull tearing apart, but guns blazing until the last breath, and though it died, it took the hunters with it, saving the whisper that had summoned them. The survivors wept, their voices shaking, for they had never seen such sacrifice, never seen warriors who gave their lives not for conquest but for the promise of a single voice crying in the dark. On the flagship the admiral stood tall, the battle raging outside, his officers shouting reports of losses and kills. But his focus never shifted, his eyes locked on the storm ahead, for he knew breaking through it was the only way to strike at the heart. "Signal the fleet," he commanded. "We drive forward. Shields to maximum. Engines full." At once the formation shifted, the humans pressing into the storm, enemy fire striking like hammers, ships shaking, some breaking apart, but the fleet did not stop. Lightning from the storm tore through space, frying systems, burning hulls, but still they pushed. It was madness, it was suicide, yet it was the only way, and the humans roared into the storm with defiance. The enemy followed, their laughter faltering as the humans refused to break, and soon the storm swallowed them all, chaos of light and death wrapping them in fire. Inside the storm the battle became nightmare, sensors blind, comms screaming with static, ships colliding, bolts of energy ripping through friend and foe alike, but still the humans fought. Still they carved a path, their guns blazing into the dark. And then, through the storm, the heart appeared. A colossal station, black as night, larger than any city, surrounded by fleets and shipyards, its surface glowing with rivers of fire, a fortress of shadow where the enemy command ruled. The sight froze even the bravest hearts, for it was a monster of steel and flame, yet the admiral only whispered, "There it is. The heart of darkness." And in that moment, though the fleet was battered, though the storm raged and death pressed on every side, humanity's fire burned brighter, for they had reached the very place no survivor had ever dared to return, and here they would write their answer in fire. The heart of darkness loomed ahead, a black fortress of steel and fire larger than mountains, surrounded by fleets that filled the void like endless waves, their red lights glowing like the eyes of demons, and for a moment the human fleet, battered and scarred, seemed like small sparks facing a storm, yet those sparks burned with fury no shadow could smother. On the flagship the admiral stood tall, his hands gripping the rail, his eyes locked on the monstrous station, and his voice carried across every ship, steady and unyielding. "This is what we came for." The whisper reached us across the stars, and today we answer not with silence, not with surrender, but with fire. All units, prepare for the final strike. At once the fleet roared to life, engines blazing, shields glowing, weapons primed, every crew member ready for what they all knew might be their last battle, and yet none wavered, for their mission was clear, their vow unbroken. The survivors in the broken vessel listened, their hearts pounding, their eyes wet with tears, for never had they believed anyone would stand here, before the fortress of their nightmares, but humanity stood, and humanity was not afraid. Then the enemy spoke, a voice vast and cruel echoing from the fortress itself. "Foolish humans, you crawl into the heart of our empire as ants crawl into fire. You will burn, and your worlds will follow." But the admiral did not answer with words. Instead his order thundered, "All ships, attack!" And the void exploded. Human warships surged forward, unleashing torrents of plasma, railgun fire, and missile storms, their fury striking against enemy fleets in blinding flashes, tearing through the first lines, scattering ships like broken glass. The enemy responded with overwhelming fire, beams of red energy carving through space, slamming against human shields, ripping through hulls, turning ships into flaming wrecks, yet still the humans pressed on, their formation tight, their purpose iron. The battle became chaos, the void lit by endless fire, debris raining like meteors, explosions shaking the storm itself, but through it all the human fleet drove toward the fortress, each ship a blade cutting through the dark. One by one ships fell, crews sacrificing themselves to keep the line moving forward, destroyers throwing their broken bodies in front of incoming fire, carriers launching every last fighter in suicidal charges, battleships blazing until their cores went dark, and every sacrifice pushed the fleet closer, closer to the heart. On the flagship officers shouted, alarms screamed, smoke filled the air, but the admiral's voice cut through like steel. "Keep moving. No retreat. The heart must fall." And his people obeyed, their hands steady even as death closed in, their fire unbroken. At last, after endless waves of enemy ships, the fortress itself came into range, its massive guns awakening, firing beams that tore entire cruisers apart in single blasts, its shields shimmering like a wall of stars, its power unmatched, and for a moment it seemed impossible, a mountain no blade could cut. But humanity did not stop. They poured every shot into the shields, hammering again and again, their weapons glowing red from heat, their ships shaking under recoil, and slowly, painfully, cracks began to show. The survivors in their vessel watched in awe, whispering through tears, "They are breaking it. They are breaking the heart." The enemy screamed in fury, unleashing reinforcements from hidden docks, new fleets pouring into the void, but the humans met them head-on, their fighters darting like sparks, their cruisers tearing apart anything that moved, their battleships hammering the shields with relentless fire. And then, at the cost of countless lives, the shield flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. The admiral's voice roared across the comms. "Now. All fire on the heart." Every remaining ship unleashed its fury in one final storm, missiles streaking, plasma blazing, railguns cracking, every shot aimed at the fortress, and the shield broke with a scream of energy, collapsing in shards of light. The fortress lay bare. The enemy's voice thundered in rage, "You dare," but the humans had no time for words. They struck with everything they had left, fire pouring into the fortress, tearing through towers and shipyards, ripping open its black surface, explosions blooming across its body like burning flowers. The station fought back, guns blazing, destroying ship after ship, but still the humans fired, even as they died, their last breath spent in fury. On the flagship the admiral knew what must be done. The fortress was too vast to fall from outside fire alone, its core had to be destroyed. He turned to his officers, his voice calm. "Prepare the flagship. We ram the heart." Shock filled the bridge, but none argued, for they knew he was right, and one by one they nodded, their eyes shining with pride. The admiral sent his last message across the fleet. "You have fought with honor beyond measure. Today we write our name in the stars. Carry this fire home. Let the galaxy know humanity does not bow to shadows." Then he gave the final command, "All power to engines. Forward." The flagship roared, engines blazing brighter than suns, fire streaming behind it as it cut through the battlefield, enemy ships throwing themselves in the way only to be torn apart by its guns, missiles, and sheer momentum, until at last it reached the fortress, the black mountain looming ahead. Inside the fortress the enemy screamed in panic, their arrogance breaking as they realized what was coming, but it was too late. The flagship crashed into the heart with all the fury of Earth behind it, tearing through walls of steel, blazing into the core, and in that instant the void exploded. A light brighter than any sun erupted, swallowing the fortress, swallowing the fleets, swallowing the storm itself, a roar of fire and vengeance echoing across the stars, the final roar of humanity's wrath. When the light faded, the fortress was gone, the heart of darkness shattered into drifting ruins, the enemy fleets scattered, their command broken. Silence returned, heavy and endless, but it was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of victory. Across the battlefield the few surviving human ships floated, scarred and burning but alive, their crews staring at the ruins in awe. In the broken vessel the survivors wept, clutching each other, whispering again and again, "They heard us. They answered, we are not alone." And though the cost was beyond measure, though countless lives had been lost, the whisper that had once drifted lonely across the stars had become a roar that shook the galaxy, a roar that would never be forgotten, for humanity had come when no one else did, and in the heart of darkness they had lit a fire that no shadow could ever put out.